Thank you, President Solis. And with those welcomes, we're excited to begin the proceedings for the Hemispheric Security Conference. Kicking us off is a fantastic Davos-style conversation, although a little modified via Zoom. Moderating the discussion will be the director of the Jack D. Gore Institute for Public Policy, my boss and friend, Brian Fonseca.
Thanks, Randy. Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is, I'll tell you, refreshing, but still a little awkward to be back in person. We've held the last 2 years of our conference virtually, and so it feels good getting back in the scene, but at the same time, we now have to share this with the virtual space. But it also allows us to do some really amazing things, like what we're going to talk about now with the NSC Senior Director of Western Hemisphere Affairs, Mr. Juan Gonzalez, and I'm going to give him a proper introduction. Originally, I got 3 pages of biography that I was supposed to read verbatim, but I know he would get really upset at me if I did that, and I'll get a whole bunch of messages saying don't, so I'm going to be very brief in my introduction. It's probably a better view if you look off to the sides where you see him on the screen than looking up here, but let me give a proper introduction, and then I'll cede the time to Juan to provide some opening remarks before we get into a discussion. So Juan Gonzalez is Special Assistant to President Biden and the NSC Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs. He has a plethora of experience in various capacities of government, including a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2016 to 2017, Special Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden from 2013 to 2015, NSC Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2011 to 2013, and in the Department of State's Bureau for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Chief of Staff to the Assistant Secretary of State. But I'll tell you one I think of the more prominent roles was the fact that he was a guest lecturer here at FIU a few years ago. Now, I'm kidding about that, sort of, but we were really honored to have you a few years ago in the classroom, Juan, and so it's great to have you here, even if virtually. And so with that introduction, Juan, I'm going to turn it over to you to provide some opening remarks, and then we'll engage in the discussion. We'll probably take about 45 minutes engaged in discussion here, and then I want to come to the audience for questions from the audience here in person, or the nearly 150, 200 that we have online. You guys can submit your questions virtually, and we'll weave them into the conversation. So with that, Juan, I cede the floor to you.
Thanks very much, Brian. And I apologize I cannot be there in person, but as I'm sure you've been reading the press, there's a lot going on in the region, and the job of the senior director is not to do the job of the State Department, but to coordinate policy. And so that's why I had to stay behind, but really did not want to miss this opportunity to participate in the conference and to engage with, I think, what's been a very, very vibrant space for dialogue on regional topics that FIU has become one of the most important games in town when it comes to having these conversations. I also really, I think, fortunate to have special advisor for the summit, W. Muckersole Powell, somebody who is known in Florida and has played, I think, a vital role in helping our preparations for the Summit of the Americas, but also to really get some ground truth on really what the community is, what matters to the community, and helping us, communicate directly with diaspora that care deeply about the region. Look, I guess the way that I would preview our conversation, Brian, is by saying that we are at the president talks about a moment of inflection that happens once every couple generations. And indeed, throughout our history, when the United States has been in conflict in other parts of the world, or there's been conflicts in Central Europe, have really led to major realignments of US policy toward the Americas. And he believes that this is such a time. And those times require us to, I think, rethink frameworks, question our assumptions, develop new tools to ensure that we're most effectively advancing our national security interests. So what do I mean by that is that, look, the international national security strategic guidance which will ultimately be issued in a national security strategy. But there's been a delay, obviously, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Probably we want to modify some sections of it. But it lays out very clearly that the vital national security interests of the United States are inextricably linked to the fortunes of our closest neighbors in the Americas. So, I think it's an important statement that recognizes that what happens in Latin America and the Caribbean impacts us more than any other part of the world. And therefore, we need to be active and have an affirmative agenda to respond appropriately. I would argue that at a time when the United States is bringing together a coherent response by the international community in Europe to Russia's unilateral invasion of Ukraine, our ability to do that and to project influence abroad depends on a Latin America and the Caribbean that is stable and prosperous. Because Latin America is not at war, because there are not these intermestic conflicts that exist in the Middle East and other areas. In some ways, the Western Hemisphere represents a strategic reservoir for the United States and is one that is based on this international consensus or this hemispheric consensus in favor of democracy in the region. So when we're talking about times of kind of realignment, you can go as far back as the Monroe Doctrine, when we worked with the UK to ensure that Spain and France did not retake its former colonies. That was the origins of the Monroe Doctrine. You had Cordell Hull's engagement with the countries of South America to advance a good neighbor policy and prevent countries from joining the Axis before World War II. You have, of course, the famous Alliance for Progress, where the United States marshaled a significant amount of assistance and investment, and in fact, it is what led to the creation of the modern-day Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau to respond to Soviet expansion. And then, of course, there was the Cold War actions, which we don't like to talk about, but we need to, I think, recognize as a moment in history. But then you look at the 1994 Summit of the Americas, and it was a time when the United States put forward this vision of a leader-level summit that would really bring the hemisphere together behind a common agenda. In those days, he made a call for a free trade area of the Americas that, while something that after 2005 ran into some significant roadblocks, nonetheless informed over 20 years of US foreign policy based on a free trade agenda. We have more free trade agreements than in the hemisphere than with any other part of the world. And at the same time, the way that US assistance was deployed around the world focused toward poverty reduction. And so therefore, the focus shifted to countries in conflict or broader humanitarian crisis on the other side of the Atlantic. And in the United States, in the Western Hemisphere, the focus was on trade as a way of really anchoring the transitions from autocracy to democracy. And assistance was not seen as the main tool to really build institutions of governance as they were in other parts of the world. Well, look, those tools have served us, but they've also, I think, in hindsight, were insufficient. Meaning that I think we all recognize now that free trade agreements led to dislocations, did not address some of the, I think, sustained inequalities in our societies, did not reduce violence. If anything, GDP growth in Latin America and the Caribbean has led to an increase in inequality and an increase in violence. And so we need to think about what are the frameworks and tools that today we need to develop to address the challenges of today, including China, including the impact of Russia. And I'll finish with this, Brian, and go straight to questions. What that requires us to do is to, I think outside the box, and look at tools that were deployed to help former Soviet states, the development of enterprise funds, maybe taking a look at the income criteria established by the World Bank as a metric for how international financial institutions deploy funding, particularly concessional funding. We need to be asking questions about how the Caribbean, a region that is seen as middle and high income could at a moment's notice be completely wiped out by a hurricane, but still be considered a high income region. There needs to be a creative way to look at how we can actually support our immediate neighbors to address the impact of climate change, to adapt to the global energy transition, and to thrive as democratic societies. And then lastly, I think that the ambition that President Clinton laid out on free trade provided us with a very strong foundation upon which to build. We have trade agreements with countries stretching from Canada to Chile that really were always intended to be a foundation upon which we should be building and reaffirming, I think, the social contract that governments have with their people to make sure that democracy deliver by working to deliver an equity of outcomes, reducing inequality, investing in education, and actually empowering the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean to be what we need them to be for our own national security interests, which is, as the president likes to say, secure, middle-class, democratic. I'll leave it there, Brian, and happy to enter into specifics.
Thanks for that, Juan. I appreciate the candor. It's not easy to advocate for sort of tectonic shifts in policy, but it sounds like that's what you're leaning towards in terms of a realignment of U.S. policy. Can you talk a little bit more about, you mentioned sort of tools. What do some of those tools look like as we think about tectonic shift in policy, a break from sort of the historical approach, at least our contemporary approach to policy towards the region? What are some of the more prized tools in America's toolbox that will allow us to continue to advocate hemispheric and of course, U.S. national interests in the region?
Yeah, I mean, and let me start with sanctions policy and refer to some of the actions that we've taken this week. I think anybody who's done research on sanctions policy, and certainly I think folks at FIU in their, I think, published works will tell you that sanctions policy alone, and especially sanctions policy when levied unilaterally, has never actually led to regime change anywhere in the world. It does lead to often a change in behavior. And so if that being the case, how do we actually use sanctions policy effectively in the Americas? And I would use the Cuba example, and I think people are hearing news about a potential return to the negotiating table in Mexico City by the regime and the unity platform, which we would applaud. Our policy is already changing to reflect the following core principles. Number one is always support dialogue, but support a viable dialogue that produces concrete outcomes, number one. Number two is expand the international consensus around US policies, or certainly in favor of matters of human rights, democratic outcomes, and indeed, I would say, as it relates to Venezuela, that consensus exists. I think whereas the Lima Group organized around the United States, I think they originally thought we had a plan. They realized that we were playing politics. And I think now they're realizing that we are committed to the negotiation process, and that consensus exists. So making sure that you have a robust diplomatic plan around your policies. And then the third is to develop, I think, targeted and effective sanctions directed toward changing specific behavior or rewarding outcomes. And I would say our policy framework with regard to Venezuela is very clear. We will alleviate pressure on the basis of concrete, irreversible, and ambitious outcomes that bring Venezuela closer toward free and fair elections. And we'll only do it on the basis of that. If there is a steps backward or there's a breakdown in talks, we will equally reapply sanctions pressure to punish that. That is the only way that the United States is going to alleviate pressure on the regime, is on the basis of outcomes of the negotiations. We're also going to continue to pursue criminal actors and the ill-gotten gains that have been stolen from the Venezuelan people. Equally in Cuba, what we took yesterday was a series of practical steps that are focused on supporting the Cuban people, while at the same time, we are holding the regime accountable by continuing to impose sanctions on individuals guilty of human rights, by continuing to elevate the discourse on human rights, particularly labor rights. But we will talk to the Cubans on matters of I think, shared and unilateral interests, migration, human rights, and other sort of issues. And then on Nicaragua, we have now made, and something that Special Envoy Ricardo Zuniga can speak to this more, have now made 4 overtures to try to talk to the Nicaraguans and have a constructive conversation about the way forward. And we are moving in a direction where, really in the absence of clear steps by them to release political prisoners and to stop using migration as a weapon, we're going to continue to impose pressure as we have since the fraudulent elections of November. So that's a very clear, I think, framework for how we would use sanctions policy. But the others are tougher conversations, Brian, because a lot of times when we're talking about the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks, the conversations start with the World Bank, which is the big core institution. But given not just the core challenges of poverty, of internal conflict, of humanitarian disaster in other parts of the world, the historic levels of migration that the United States is experiencing have important national security implications for us. The impact of the pandemic on the Americas has significant impacts for us, and the economic, I think, situation that the region is continuing to endure threatens the very political order that is something that I mentioned is a strategic reservoir for the United States. So we should be looking at the hemisphere specifically to see how we can use the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, work with the CAF, with the Caribbean Development Bank, and other institutions to make sure that we are developing new tools, new markets, and new approaches to today's challenges.
Thanks, Juan. And I'll add, sort of unlocking the power of American institutions, universities, think tanks, private sectors to support engaging and in deepening the relationships that we have with the region. So I appreciate your candor on that. News is already starting to circulate about, the possible relieving of sanctions in Venezuela by the Biden administration. So I appreciate you tackling that early. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic. You just mentioned it, or at least referenced it in your remarks. And I'd like to tease out a little bit more about sort of the impact that the pandemic is having on state fragility across the Americas, sort of the resurgent in areas of authoritarian leaders, or at least authoritarian leaning leaders, sort of under the guise of democracy. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that pervasive impact that the pandemic is having, and what we can expect in the next 1 to 5 years as it continues to sort of take its course in the socioeconomic, political, and security spaces?
Yeah, no, thanks, Brian. So, of course, the region represents 8% of the population, but 28% of the pandemic-related deaths. So it was the most impacted region in terms of deaths, but also in terms of the economic impact. That was happening at the impact of the pandemic has aggravated some of the structural challenges that the region has long had, that Latin American experts are very well aware. We were seeing since 2014 a decrease in economic growth. We were seeing an increase in inequality and poverty. We were seeing growing frustration by populations with lack of access to education, to jobs. In Colombia, the place that, as you know, is very near and dear to me, you would have examples of economists, lawyers that were graduating and forced to drive cabs because they were not able to find jobs in their profession. And there were protests throughout the hemisphere well before the pandemic with this dissatisfaction. What the pandemic has done is it has contributed to a growing disillusionment with 40 years of democratic transition in the hemisphere. What we're seeing, particularly in South America, is not a movement to the left, as some people have commented, but if you look at region-wide polls, there is an anti-incumbency perspective on the part of most Latin Americans who feel that governments are governing for a few political and economic elite and not really governing on behalf of other people. And you've heard me say this as well, as the region nears the end of its demographic dividend, meaning the number of younger working age people is getting to a point where it's no longer larger than the aging population. Latin America is running out of time to be able to kind of take it to that next level of development. You have elements where you have a region that is highly dependent on fossil fuels at a time when the world is transitioning to renewable energies, notwithstanding the moment right now with Russia and the increase in oil prices. You have inequality that is rampant and an inability to deploy human capital in an effective way. And you have a centralization still of political, I think, and economic power and rampant inequality. And so these are core challenges that the region needs to address, and it's running out of time to do so. And as we, I think, move on in years, the inaction will lead to, I think, a rise of populist leaders who promise big ideas but really govern undemocratically. And that, over time, will pose an increasing national security threat to the United States. So what is the answer? The answer is, it's also an environment that is ripe for Chinese expansion. It is an area where Russian disinformation, in some cases, is winning the day. If we don't drive into the space with some concrete plans, then I think we will continue to lose the influence that we were already starting to lose over the last 4 years.
So thanks for that. Well, on that note, let's talk a little about sort of Chinese expansion in the region. China, as a global competitor, has been at the forefront of American foreign policy in terms of how to approach the global geopolitical competition with China. We've certainly seen, an exponential growth, 26-fold growth of Chinese engagement, financial investment in the region since 2000. Where it was a mere $12 billion a year in terms of investment. It's 26 times that now. How does the White House, how do you see sort of the growth of China in its relation to sort of the vitality of democracies in the region, and then of course relative to our influence or our interests in the region?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I always like to caveat the conversations over China to make very clear that, the U.S. private sector still remains, I think, one of the overwhelming kind of numbers, and I think outpace China in most places. And number two, when you look at the trade statistics, you see that China is really still predominantly importing, protein and fuel from the region, whereas U.S. investment really has focused on higher value-added outputs, and so they benefit the people of the region more. And obviously, everybody knows the stories about Chinese labor coming in, but also the shoddy infrastructure investment, the kind of rampant corruption that it brings, and frankly, when it comes to the sharing of vaccines, that it always comes with strings attached. So I'll say two things. The first is that there is an element of buyer's remorse with China. We're a region that, I've said many times, has literally given in carne propia, it's bled to be able to defend its human rights and its democratic freedoms. I think anybody who studies the region knows that we have been on this 200-year experiment, but over the last 30 years have really fought to make sure that democracy, after authoritarian revolutionary governments have failed, have really coalesced around democracy as the way forward, and people like their democracy. And they see that Chinese investment comes with strings attached and is a potential threat to those democratic values. The question is, what is the alternative? And I would use examples of leaders like President Guillermo Lasso, who has actively looked for alternatives to Chinese financing, and others where we have not been able to come in with a very quick or easy response because, unlike China, our state-owned companies aren't the ones actually bankrolling a lot of our investments. So what do we do is, I think what we need to do is I think our China strategy is one where we may not even talk about China. It has to really be an affirmative strategy toward the Americas, one that recognizes that I think the international financial architecture just doesn't work for the Americas. That when you think about the role of the Inter-American Development Bank, the traditional focus on infrastructure and poverty reduction are really insufficient to meet the challenges of today, and that with paid-in capital, we can actually have a multiplier effect to mobilize global public goods on climate change, on education, on equity, and on using the IDBs, for example, reservoir of talent to help governments tackle some of these challenges. IDB Invest, I think if you look at the capital that has been deployed by multilaterals, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, private sector capital has been severely lacking because in the region, people invest elsewhere. We need to find ways to really support the role of the private sector through IDB Invest and other institutions so that people can start and run businesses successfully. But I would also go to, beyond kind of the economic picture, the question of governance and corruption, where if we continue a track that we have too easily embraced since the Cold War, where we'll embrace leaders who agree with us, even if they're corrupt because they agree with us, I think we lose credibility on the topic. And so, the president and the vice president have laid out combating corruption as a core goal of our international policy around the world. That is nowhere more important than in the Western Hemisphere, that if we are pushing for greater transparency, accountability of governments, making sure that governments are being responsive to the people that elected them, that in itself is an anti-China strategy because it empowers those who elect their leaders to hold them accountable. And that's really, I think, something that is the core of our engagement with the region.
I think it's a great point, and I think that's one of those things that we have to continue to highlight that differentiates U.S. engagement in the region against Chinese engagement in the region. There are several sectors in which the Chinese have really, really sort of spiked in terms of their engagement in the region, which I tend to consider strategic areas. And I wanted to see if you're willing to comment on, what the White House thinks about China's engagement in areas like tech and tech proliferation. There's no doubt that there's a surge in Chinese digital infrastructure across the hemisphere, and there are, short-term, mid-term, long-term security implications, obviously, of sort of a region connected largely through Chinese technology, whether that's data centers or surveillance systems or just digital architecture in general. And two, sort of the growing contest for precious resources, minerals. I think about the lithium triangle, and I think about sort of the race in Argentina to sort of dominate resource spaces that are going to be vital strategically for American national interest. Can you comment a little bit on those strategic areas and what the White House can do to sort of ensure our competitiveness as a nation as we move into that space to compete against the Chinese?
That's an excellent question and the topic of a seminar. But I'll tell you is that, look, when we've engaged with the countries of the region, we are making very clear that we are not asking them to choose between us and China, right? We have a commercial engagement with them. We have our very real concerns about Chinese kind of predatory capitalism abroad, and we will communicate that. But there are elements of Chinese engagement and global expansion which are very concerning, particularly in their efforts to expand military bases, and then certainly the surveillance technology, which I think serves to undermine those democratic freedoms that I mentioned. But let me talk a little bit about, I think, 5G and open radio access networks, I think, to answer your question. But I'll say that when we talk to the governments of the region, we get one of three reactions. The first is they say, we don't have viable options to Huawei. Please help us, right? And there we often will be challenged because XM, DFC cannot actually provide support to middle and middle-high income countries. So there is a structural challenge to our ability to respond. In other governments will say, we don't care. We don't care if the Chinese potentially spy on us. We have nothing to hide. And then what I would say is the third one is they say, oh, okay, well, we have an economic interest in doing something like this, and they themselves will take the steps. So knowing that when you're looking at Huawei, you're looking at, I think, what is generally an oligopoly, and we're a small number of companies, as it should be, given the high cost of entry and how how vertically integrated these companies are, and the margins being so low. There are a small set of actors here. What we don't like is that we don't like is who is winning in this oligopoly, and that tends to be Huawei and the offerings that they're putting forward. The reason we are so excited about open radio access network deployment and in 5G in the Western Hemisphere is that, there are studies that indicate that between now and 2025 or 2030, 5G and IoT has a potential of $150 billion in development potential for Latin America and the Caribbean. That'll vary depending on who you ask. Now, the question is, do the countries of the region want an outside company to come in, kind of lock in all, full service shop from the outside to be the vendor of those services? Or does Latin America and the Caribbean want to become a player in the 5G sector? So what we want to try to do is develop the market mechanisms, like I mentioned, is finding ways to better deploy private capital to facilitate the deployment of open radio access networks in Latin America and the Caribbean, which are software-based, and where countries like Argentina, Brazil, Colombia have very strong software sectors, could develop and kind of their own endemic companies in this. When we went to Brazil last year with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, we talked about them developing the embryo of 5G, where if you get the right investors, if you have the right technical support, it is something that is scalable. And the U.S. is already being deployed by Dell and Dish Networks. That by next year, we're going to have 75% coverage of 5G in Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, in the United States. India is deploying this already beyond just greenfields as actually something that is scalable. If you're in a population above 100 million, maybe it hasn't been proven, but that gives us a lot of space for this to be adopted in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what is required is a technological know-how and the support for to be able to bankroll and support companies that want to dive into this space. So this is a market solution to a market challenge, and one that is bent on empowering and giving agency to countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, not an anti-Huawei strategy, it's a pro-Latin America strategy. And that is really what is the common theme along our economic and political agenda with the Americas.
Thanks, Juan. Your camera went off for just a second. It always seems that when we talk about China and tech, something goes wrong with our tech. And so it leads me to believe they're piped in. No, any thoughts about sort of the strategic resource space? We talk about oil, we talk about lithium, cobalt. Is there a U.S. strategy? I saw recently, sort of U.S. enacted the Defense Production Act, and there have been calls to sort of expand that beyond U.S. borders to support American enterprises that are engaged in strategic resource extraction in other parts of the world, UK and Australia being two places where Congress seems to be advocating it. Any thoughts in terms of how, again, we can continue to support that strategic resource space?
Yeah, no, thank you for following up on that. So the executive order on this issue stated very clearly that the United States cannot make everything on its own. And we need to look to our partners and allies to ensure that we have the supplies to compete in the century. I'll be very candid here, is that our number one focus right now, it's not exclusive, but our number one focus is North America. And so if you've seen, a lot of the things that we have done over the first year has been really focused on reestablishing these frameworks and institutional infrastructure that went into disrepair over the last 4 years with Canada, where we have a critical minerals dialogue, but also the high-level economic dialogue with Mexico that also includes a microprocessors component. We're talking to them about matters related to critical minerals, because for us, there is no, for the United States in particular, there's no better existing supply chain platform or economic kind of partners than our North American partners, given the over 20 years of NAFTA and now the USMCA. But we can't stop there. And I think that the conversations and it's actually been fascinating to see the three presidents during the North American Leaders Summit went way off script that we had kind of laid out for them, to talk about really how North America can be not just a platform for our competitiveness, but one where we can project in a coordinated fashion to support Central America, to work with South America, to support our neighbors in the Caribbean, all with a vision that we need to support their kind of economic and developmental goals. And so in that regard, we are having conversations with Argentina, we are having conversations with Brazil, but it has all started with North America. What you'll see is, now that Amos Hochstein, who is a special advisor to the secretary and somebody who's very close to the president, his task has been to map out a lot of these conversations with key allies, making clear that there are critical minerals that we have a fair supply of in the United States. But there are others that we need to look at, from graphite to cobalt to others, that we need to, strategically either make sure that China doesn't just buy up and sit on it, but that it is available for investors to use, all within a private sector framework that will allow the private sector to have what it needs to be able to develop its products and to compete in an open market.
Thanks for that, Juan. So I'm going to ask one more question, but I just want to let the audience know in the room that if you have a question, line up at the microphones. But I'm going to ask one more for you, Juan, while people are lining up. And if you're online, we are getting those questions, and I'll weave them into the conversation. I'm avoiding questions about the summit altogether because I know the Congresswoman is going to be here in a few minutes, and she's going to, talk, about the summit. But my last question comes back to something you started off with very early on, and that has to do with sort of implications of Russia's expansion of its invasion of the Ukraine. It's been, it's certainly been in the Donbass region. It expanded militarily. How is that affecting the way we're looking from a policy perspective at our equities in the Western Hemisphere?
I mean, it's an excellent question. What I'll say first is that, while the pandemic was something that was out of our control, the questions about Russia's invasion of Ukraine has prompted a very active debate. Part of that debate has been influenced by active disinformation by Russia. But make no mistake here, any country that is committed to its sovereignty and rejects unilateral military action, and certainly the attack of the attack of civilians, unarmed civilians, should be rejecting the Russian action. And that was, by and large, the reaction we saw at the UN General Assembly. Over time, the impact of Russia's invasion, which has cut off food sources, has led to inflation, is something where governments are going to feel the economic squeeze, and even I think the political squeeze, and may be forced into certain decisions. And we have to be very conscious of that. It's hard to take a principled stance when people that voted for you do not have food, right? And we're seeing a lot of governments that have fertilizer supplies through August, and after that, we will see a dramatic increase in kind of food prices that we're already seeing. So what is the response? I think the first one is politically is do not let Russia provoke a Cold War response on the part of the United States. Because I think, again, an affirmative economic agenda pushing very hard against Russian expansion, malign expansion in the region is at the core of our policies. But the other is working with governments to address the inflationary impacts of these policies. There are broader questions, of course. I think some countries are asking themselves, will there be a G20 without Russia? And I think this is an active debate that has to happen. It gets into a space where I'm really out of my range here. But I think we need to talk about why the international institutions that we developed today remain relevant and today are very responsive still to the challenges that countries in the hemisphere are facing. So we are talking about making fertilizer more available, talking to countries about who can actually do more to export food, what programs we can actually develop on food security, and on those we're going to have, I think, a lot of very big things to say at the Summit of the Americas. Certainly, maybe this is a good segue as well to the Congresswoman, is the direction for the president has been for us to be ambitious, to recognize that the summit is an inflection point, and that for the United States to galvanize hemispheric action, we need to have a very clear and affirmative agenda moving forward. So he will be I think bringing that to the table, but also I think you'll see very concrete next steps coming out of the Summit of the Americas.
Thanks, Juan. So again, I'm going to encourage you, if you have questions, to line up at the mics. If you don't ask questions, you're going to have to listen to me ask questions for another 15 minutes. That should incentivize you. Okay, we got a few. We're going to go right over here.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Gracias a todos. No sé si la puedo hacer en español, si no en inglés.
Está bien. No,
Está bien en inglés, en español.
¿Cuál quieres?
En español, si es posible. Usted ya ha asegurado que la Casa Blanca decidió aliviar la presión con respecto a Venezuela. ¿Podría anunciar específicamente algunas de esas acciones? Ya las agencias de noticias han adelantado que podrían estar relacionadas a licencias petroleras, a sanciones personales específicas. La plataforma unitaria les pidió a ustedes que esto ocurriera para que ellos vuelvan a la mesa. ¿Qué ha dado Maduro a cambio? Y si efectivamente Nicolás Maduro no cumple, estas sanciones van a revertirse. Y por otro lado, rapidito, si ya tienen una confirmación si serán invitados o no Nicaragua, Venezuela y Cuba a la Cumbre de las Américas.
Gracias por esa pregunta. Mire, yo creo que la respuesta no voy a entrar en detalles en los pasos específicos que vamos a tomar, porque siempre van a ser en respuesta a lo que anuncien el régimen y la plataforma unitaria. Es posible que ya hayan anunciado y no haya visto. Y nosotros saldremos con una declaración en respuesta a lo que digan los dos lados. Pero no se le está aliviando ninguna presión al régimen, no se le va a llegar ningún ingreso al régimen. Son medidas muy específicas que se están haciendo en respuesta a un pedido del gobierno interino y la plataforma unitaria. Y sí, vuelvo a repetir que la política de sanciones nuestra será calibrada en base a avances en las negociaciones, se aliviará la presión y volverá a implementar la presión si no hay avances y si hay retrocesos. Eso es muy claro. Hay dos caminos aquí. En cuanto a las invitaciones, esa decisión, el presidente no hemos todavía mandado invitaciones, pero tendremos noticias sobre eso pronto.
Thank you. Adam.
Thank you for coming. I have a quick question for you, which is, you started off with a review of some of the high points of U.S. Latin American foreign policy, but each of these was also coupled with a refocus at the domestic level for U.S. citizens on Latin America and an increase in people-to-people exchanges. What is the administration going to do to make that happen today?
Excellent question. So, certainly, right now, the debate over migration, I think some look at the border as really the center point of this conversation. But in the conversations, for those that are following the region, and the conversations we've been having with the countries of the region, the run-up to the summit, there is a broad recognition that the region is experiencing a once-in-a-century economic and political crisis as a result of the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine that is leading record levels of people to decide that they want to leave their homes. Right now we have, whereas before the pandemic, Mexico had a negative migration number. We're now seeing Mexicans as the largest number. After that, it's Cubans. But we're also seeing something I never expected would be Colombians, because there is an increase in criminal activity by some groups that are displacing tens of thousands of people. We're seeing Haitians, given the situation in the country. And so I think to look at migration, it has to be recognized as a symptom of a much broader crisis that the region is experiencing that requires a more fulsome response. Certainly, in all of these cases throughout history, as you mentioned, educational exchanges has been a key component of this. And I think that there's one area that I think, particularly the area of 100,000 strong that was launched by President Obama at the 2012 summit, that we're going to double down on, and working with the private sector to really expand the efforts of on these sorts of educational exchanges. Where I think we could do better is that the pandemic led a lot of people to leave schools if you had the means and a computer, you could take virtual classes. But for a whole class of people, they spent over a year without actually going to school. And the impact, socioeconomic impact of that is going to be lasting. Also, obviously the undue burden on women who've had to leave the workforce to support the families during the pandemic has really had a significant gender implication to the pandemic as well. So making sure that regardless of economic background, people have access to virtual education is really an area that as the countries of the hemisphere, we need to emphasize. And it has been part of the discussions that we've had in the Supplement Implementation Review Group to really expand digital connectivity, make a commitment to expand that connectivity to the rest of the hemisphere.
Thanks, Juan. I'm going to take the next 3 questions, and then I'll take 3 from virtual, and that'll probably be our time. But we'll go, Victor, we'll start with you. Richard, you'll ask the second question, then we'll go third to Beatrice. So ask your questions, and then Juan, if that's okay, we'll take 3, and then you can field the 3 questions.
All right, I have a question. What is the U.S. doing to help Haiti with transition and democracy? Last year, they had their prime minister assassinated. So what is the U.S. doing to help with transitioning with the new prime minister, but as well as bringing prosecution to the assassins?
Thanks, Victor. Richard.
Yeah, so my question was, do you feel that there's any grounds, probably where you can maybe there be a partnership or cooperation with China and Latin America and the Caribbean, maybe with regards to development or humanitarian aid and disaster relief?
Thanks, Richard. Beatrice.
Hi. I would like to know what is it that we are planning to do about nearshoring, because as the world economy is evolving, we are seeing that we are going to have 2 very important economic blocks. One in Asia led by China, one in the West, I assume led by the United States. But Europe already has a policy for nearshoring. They have put 6 billion euros into African countries in order to support the development of infrastructure that's going to facilitate trade into Europe. What are we doing? Or is it that we don't care, or it's not important for our government to retake the economic leadership in the world?
Thank you. So Juan, we had a question on Haiti, on partnerships,
Yep.
and on nearshoring.
Yeah, sure. No, look, on Haiti, obviously the situation there is probably as bad, if not worse, than the period immediately after the fall of Duvalier regime. The levels of violence are threatening even any sort of semblance of, I think, normalcy and stability in Port-au-Prince. The food security crisis was one that predated the earthquake and the assassination of Moise. I think right now the political situation in the country and the question of elections and transition, I think, are secondary to creating those conditions for Haitians to be able to exercise the right to vote freely, fairly, and securely. Those conditions currently do not exist. I think while elections are key, imposing an arbitrary date for elections, I think would be counterproductive without a clear way forward on what it's going to take to establish those conditions. In the aftermath of the assassination of Moise, we have been supporting dialogue between all actors and doing something that goes against kind of our historical instinct. And we've not sought to impose a direction, but rather put all our time and energy in promoting dialogue between all political actors so that the Haitians can come together with a way forward in the country. The security situation is key, and not necessarily billions of dollars in foreign assistance, of which we've provided 6.5 billion since 2010, are going to be a differentiating factor in the absence of a clear steps to improve the security situation and a agreement of agreements that brings together all the different political actors behind a clear way forward in the country. The question of China is related to this because as we've sought to extend the mandate of BNU, or even expand its mandate to have a greater supporting role at the UN Security Council, China has blocked this time and time again, and has not allowed us to actually have the United Nations expand broader training, have a broader presence, all because of Haiti's recognition of Taiwan. I think that's counterproductive. And it's something we're going to continue to push so that it is a multilateral response to help Haiti and the people of Haiti, certainly in close coordination with CARICOM, that has, I think, a very special role to play, and a voice that we need to listen to and respect. Can we find areas of common ground with China? Of course. Particularly as we look at issues of humanitarian assistance, disaster response. There are areas where we can certainly work. And I recall that, when we started our U.S.-China sub-dialogue on Latin America, which was inaugurated by Tom Shannon, we sought to find ways to work together. Ultimately, they did not produce bear fruit, because that was ultimately not the interest that China had. We'll continue to look for ways to work with China where we can, compete where we have to, and confront where necessary. But I think we are going to hold fast to our principles and the norms that really define this region as something that is not really up for negotiation in the hemisphere. On the issue of nearshoring, look, there may be experts on supply chains and nearshoring in the audience. I am not one of them. What I do know is that when you're talking about supply chains, there is a broad definition of what they entail. What is also clear is that there is a question of resilience, but the act of nearshoring a supply chain requires creating, first of all, identifying those supply chains that have a comparative economic advantage in the region somewhere. The second is working with the private sector to develop the regulations, the tools, and the incentives for the supply chains to be nearshore. We are having those conversations very actively with our partners in North America. We are going to be, as a part of our kind of economic strategy into the summit, looking to expand that conversation with a lot of our free trade partners, recognizing that it is not flipping a switch, but it requires governments to step up and make, create the necessary environment for the private sector to want to do this, because they know that the business environment is dependable, that the transparency is such that they know that there's dependability to their investment, and that there are the regulatory structure in place, but also the human capital, so that the supply chain, the decision to move a supply chain, is something that is going to produce economic benefits for a company or a sector.
Thanks, Juan. I'm going to ask two last questions. Both of them come online. I'm going to fuse some of them together. The first is, over reports that some of the heads of state are not going to attend the summit. In your thoughts, what happens if the heads of state of Mexico, Bolivia, Belize, or CARICOM nations choose not to attend the Summit of the Americas? That's one. And two, fusing a couple questions together, sort of in the face of increased Chinese military engagement globally, how is the Biden administration leveraging the U.S. military as an instrument of national power in the Americas?
It's an excellent question. And I'll defer most of that second part to Daniel Erickson, who knows this and is versed in this much more than I am. Look, on the issue of participation, I think there's a lot of intrigue and debate in the press about who's going to show up and who's not going to show up. The conversations that we've had with Mexico, with the Caribbean community, and with others have been about the need to come together as the region to develop a common and ambitious path to address a lot of the shared challenges before us. We've previewed some of the things that the president has asked us to work on, and all of which respond to some of the core asks from our CARICOM partners, from our partners in Central America, from allies in South America. We've been very clear that this is a forum where, for open debate, where we invite criticism, invite active back and forth and the puts and takes of these debates that the President of the United States relishes. But people need to show up to be able to shape the agenda. And I think we're confident that the countries of the region that are interested in coming together to do something about the challenges that we're facing will show up. Those that want to make a spectacle will do so.
Thanks, Juan. And again, as Juan pointed out, we'll host Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Dan Erickson tomorrow. And so, Juan, again, I can't thank you enough for joining us, for the partnership that you have with FIU, and again, your commitment to service of nation from the White House. So thanks again. Look forward to continue our engagement with you. With that, that concludes our opening session. I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Randy Pastana to provide guidance.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Juan. Can we please give a round of applause for that fantastic discussion?